A new topic today. We spent 4 weeks on abortion, and we're going to move into something new. And one of the big ones, I would say, for the country, this one. Today I'm going to kind of set some groundwork on it. We need to kind of set some foundations to build on, okay? And so here's some questions we're going to tackle with the immigration discussion. Okay, here's kind of the big ones, some of the big ones I want to talk about. Does the Bible support the enforcement of national borders? That'd probably be an important thing to know. Would you agree? Does that have to do with immigration? Yes. How does the Bible define migrant? Now, we use these terms, and we have an understanding in our minds of what they mean, but what's the biblical perspective of these things? What words did they use? So we'll talk about that one a little bit. Shouldn't American Christians support open borders and all immigration, legal and illegal, because it's the loving thing to do for people seeking a better life? That's next week. Okay, that's going to need a whole week in itself. So that'll be next week. We'll talk about that one. So these are just a few of the questions that we're going to tackle. As I was working on this week, I kept saying, okay, I need to ask more questions. And so you're going to see more questions a lot as we go through this. Yeah, there's going to be more. So this is kind of a general guideline, but these are important ones to kind of walk through from a biblical standpoint. So before we get to immigration, we're going to talk about the origin of national borders in this thing called cosmic geography. Have you ever heard of this before? Cosmic geography? Okay, we've been doing a sermon series. We're kind of into it now on spiritual warfare. And there is an element of that goes on in the national border discussion because of how the ancients understood the nations. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So today's going to be we got to build some foundation before we can put some walls up. Okay, that's kind of what we're going to do today. Unintended. Unintended. We're not building any walls, so we got a foundation. No pun intended. That's right. That's right. So look at this in Deuteronomy 32. Okay, this is Deuteronomy 32:7. This is actually called the Song of Moses. So he's about to pass the baton, and he writes this kind of reflection and, reflecting on what they've been and where they're going and these things. And he says, "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you your elders, and they will tell you." So what is he saying with that? We're going to go back and talk about the beginning, or a while back when things were being formed and shaped. Okay? And he says the only people you can ask are your founder, your elders, the people who came before you, your parents, maybe your grandparents. And then he goes in and he says this: "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage," or inheritance, some might say in that one. So Moses' perspective, when you look back, is what happened at some point in the past. What did God do? He fixed the borders. He established the lines of the nations. And he had a method of doing this. Okay? Now, I'm not going to take us in a rabbit trail because I could spend 2 weeks in a rabbit trail right here. Because you see where it says number of the sons of God? Some translations will say sons of Israel, depending on what you look at. And this is a hotly debated discussion amongst Bible scholars. Because if you look at the most recent, this thing called the Masoretic text, okay, these Masoretes got together and wanted to preserve the Old Testament scriptures. So they had, basically in the AD time frame, put together a collection of what they said these are the accurate translations of the Old Testament. They wanted to preserve it, okay? There's also another group of books, or a book, called the Septuagint. Have you ever heard of that? The LXX is what it's called, okay, the Septuagint. And what that is the Bible Jesus had. That's the Bible that was around during the time of the apostles. Now, it's older, but there's not as many texts of that. So what's the problem? We like it that it's older because it's closer to the original, but when you don't have as many to go through, it makes it a little bit harder for Bible people to say, well, it's nice when we have a whole lot of them that are old so we can make sure all the verses are the same in all the different ones. So we don't have as many, but we have older copies. You get into the Masoretic text, guess what we have? A lot more of them, but it's newer. And so now you have this debate that rages in Bible translation of oldest versus most. And so some translators will say sons of Israel because they're going off the Masoretic text. And some will say sons of God because they're going off of the Septuagint, the scrolls they found at Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Isn't that weird? Now, why the difference? I'm taking you on a little rabbit trail. I'm not going to spend 2 weeks on it. But I think it's important for you to know what he means by this. Why does that matter? So in other words, it's either people or, for lack of a better term, angels. Does that make sense? So now I want you to think about this, and that's why it's controversial, because of who is it? Now, there's arguments on both sides for this. But from a cosmic geography standpoint, think about the Old Testament. When the Israelites were traveling through the nations, did they just go up against the peoples? What about Egypt? When they were in Egypt, who was the war? What was the war that God fought? It was against who?
Their gods.
Pharaoh, but
Their gods.
the gods of Egypt. Now, if you go way back and you were in my class when we went through, the Exodus part, do you remember we talked about every plague was tied into? One of the gods of Egypt. So there has been consistently in the Old Testament a battle between Israel and its neighbors and the God of Israel and the gods of the neighbors. Cosmic geography. When they would go into a new area, a new land, it was under, in their minds, a dominion of a different being. Doesn't mean that God wasn't the ultimate one in charge, the creator who had authority over everything. But Moses seems to suggest, if you go with the Sons of God translation, that when God was picking nations, when he was dividing up the nations, at the same time he was establishing administrators from a supernatural perspective over them to make sure they did what they were supposed to do. And then what does he do, though? He says, all of you are getting angels to oversee you, but there's going to be one nation that's going to be mine directly. And who is it? Israel. That's what the idea is with what Moses is saying here if you go with the Sons of God view. Okay? Now, why do I bring this into the immigration borders discussion? Because if that's true, then other nations serve other gods. Is that not true? Think about, Saudi Arabia, Iran. There are nations that have other deities. Doesn't mean that they're God, right? But could they be spiritual beings that are lesser? Think about Egypt.
Lesser. Why you say lesser?
Though they're clearly not God, not Yahweh. Yeah. Yahweh is the most high God. That's how he's described. That actually doesn't make sense if there's no other beings. You realize that? Doesn't even make sense. Because higher than what? Nothing? So does it make sense why in a place like Egypt you might have these gods that received worship when they really aren't gods? How did the magicians in Egypt do some of the things they did? Was it just tricks, or were they empowered by demonic power? Where did that power come from? It came from somewhere. But as soon as they had to try to create flies from the dust, meaning create life, guess what the magicians couldn't do anymore? Couldn't do it. They ran out. The powers didn't have the ability to do that. So I share this with you to get you thinking from a supernatural perspective, that we think our world's so physical. It's just this nation of people in this place, and it's just these peoples. But what about the spiritual forces behind them? Who's running that country? How was it founded? On what gods was it established? Kind of interesting, huh, when you think about that. And so from a spiritual standpoint as Christians, when we get into the immigration discussion, it usually just becomes social justice and it becomes this very political thing. But what about the supernatural perspective of what happens when you cross these spiritual entities into a land? What happens? And we're going to look at that for just a second here. So here's Genesis 10. This is actually the table of nations. I'm not going to give it completely to you because it's huge. But it's basically when Noah gets off the boat, here's a list of all of the nations that came from Noah and his descendants. Okay, that's what Genesis 10 is. In fact, here's Genesis 10:32. This is how the chapter kind of closes. These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. So you had this spreading, you had these nations form ultimately from Noah's descendants. But it's kind of interesting in Genesis because you have the flood, then you get the table of nations, and then right after the table of nations you have something else. This is what happens before the table of nations. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and they settled there. What's getting ready to happen? Tower of Babel. So the author of Genesis is trying to say, okay, here's what happened with Noah, and here's all of his descendants. But before we had the nations, we have to remember, let's go back a second. Now let's remember how this began. Let's kind of do a history lesson. And so he starts going into Babel. Okay? Here's Genesis 11:6-9. The Lord said, behold, they are one people. That doesn't sound like the nations, does it? That sounds like one group, one nation. And they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they possess to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused their language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Does this not sound exactly like what Moses is saying in Deuteronomy 32? When God divided up the nations and dispersed the people groups and drew the nations, what's he referring to? When did that happen? At Babel. At Babel. So here's Genesis 12. So you have, let's do a quick recap. Table of nations, right? Then we hear about Babel. And then as soon as Babel is done, here's the next verse. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now before this, who were God's people? Everybody. Or there wasn't anybody. You could say that God saw all of humanity the same, and so maybe he hadn't chosen a specific group yet, but they were supposed to go out and do what he wanted. Humanity was, but they didn't do the right thing. So what does he do? He disperses them. And then as soon as he disperses them, he says, but I'm going to call one that I'm going to be in charge of. That's Deuteronomy 32. That's the Song of Moses background. Moses' perspective, as he writes it, is that when God did the dividing up of the nations, he had something in mind and he put administrators over them, if you take the sons of God perspective, which I think there's a number of reasons to do that. Here, I'm going to put these administrators over them. They're going to be dispersed and they're going to have their lands, but mine is Israel. That's my portion, and they come directly to me. There is no administrator. Follow? The idea here is cosmic geography. When I say cosmic, think supernatural geography. Okay? We see this because you guys remember when we went through the story of Naaman? He comes to Elijah. He wants to be healed. He gets his leprosy healed. He goes back, wants to pay him. He says, no, you're not paying me anything. And then what does he ask him for? Dirt. 2 donkey loads of dirt. Why? Why dirt? Because it's under Yahweh's dominion. I want to worship God, Yahweh, and I need his dirt to do it. So what did he do? He took it home and he made a place to sacrifice and worship God on his land. That's the whole point. This is their perspective. Okay? We've kind of lost this to some degree. We don't think about it supernaturally. We don't think about it spiritually, even though the Bible supports that. We just think of totally fleshly, totally worldly. They didn't think about it that way. So here's some things to consider. Man was instructed to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. That was humanity's instruction. We didn't do the job, did we? Man rejected this instruction and intended to stay in one place altogether. So what happens? God says, I'll disperse you myself. I will establish the nations myself. And he does. His dispersion led to the establishment of nations and borders. As they went out and they couldn't talk, so you had the languages were a big factor in that. Simultaneously, God determined one of those nations would be ruled by him. And so he calls Abram. As soon as he disperses them, he says, Abram is my portion. I'm going to call him and I'm going to get started with my country. Kind of interesting. That's the call of Abram. So here's another question. I told you we're going to have a lot of questions today. If God intended to rule all nations before Babel, I'm calling this the Edenic mandate, go be fruitful, multiply, fill the whole earth. He intended to rule all the nations before Babel, yet he chose only one nation to be his initial portion after Babel. What does that imply of all the other nations outside of Abraham's land? If these things are true, what does that mean about all the other nations outside of Israel? Some would actually put this as God, quote, divorced the nations. You were supposed to be mine. You rebelled against me. You're clearly not doing the job. I reject you all. You're not worthy of me. I'm putting administrators over you, but I will have my nation, my people. I'm going to call this guy, and he's going to do it. Now, what was the intention of the land of Israel? Why did God do this? And what was one of the big things that they were supposed to do? Yeah, worship him. What about their interactions with the other nations? What was the long-term plan of God when it came to Israel's involvement with the other nations? By being the nation of priests, what's a priest do? Makes intercession. Is the big go-between. And they would then go out and bring back all the other nations under the rule of God. But they didn't do a good job because what did they do? They fell into adultery and they fell into apostasy. See, the intention was, I'm going to use my nation to take back all the other nations. But the people weren't loyal to that. They rejected God. Now, I'm kind of in a rabbit trail a little bit here. And now, considering where we're at in the New Testament, think about Pentecost. Where did Jesus come out of? Israel. What happens after Jesus ascends at Pentecost? And who's there? People, Israelites, Jews from every country under heaven. And they hear the gospel, and what do? And so what's God doing? He's taking back all of the nations. Do you realize that? There isn't really a place, if you think about it, I know there's places that the gospel still doesn't reach, but think about worldwide, the gospel has gone out to the four corners of the earth, hasn't it? And it began then. What's God doing? Through the work of Christ, we're taking back the nations, and it came out of Israel, came out of that group, his nation, his people. So the plan's not debunked, like it's not over. But I want you to be thinking of God has this layered view. Yeah, I know that there's the human beings and there's the nations of the Arabs and there's the Americans and the Canadians but from a spiritual standpoint, it goes even deeper. And these people all need to be under my dominion. And they are. I'm going to take them back. So when Christ comes back, does he rule just Israel? No. But he might be in Israel, but who's he going to control? The whole earth. The plan is not over yet. It's about borders. It's about taking over. It's about who's in control of what lands. So there became after Babel and Abram's call a distinction between people groups, land dominion, and nations. They were located in different places, obviously. They spoke different languages. This is all Babel stuff. Now this is the key one. They worshipped different gods. And when you have a nation that worships a certain God, and then you have a nation bring in another group that worships a different God, is there going to be a problem? You bet there is. We should be thinking this as Christians as we think about immigration. The world's not going to think about this. They don't think about this. Here's Deuteronomy 4:19 through 20. He's talking to them. He says, and beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven. He's telling the Israelites this. And when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, those are obviously things we're aware of from a scientific perspective, right? How did the ancients view these things? They were deities. They were things that people worshiped. They were the gods. That's how they viewed these things. The sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven. Notice he says that right after that, all the host of heaven. You be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them. Things that the Lord your God, and then this is a key phrase, has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. What does that mean? What does it mean allotted them to the peoples under heaven? That sounds like nations. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are this day. Do you get the theme that keeps popping up? This is my people, and there are other entities that are basically being worshipped by all these others. And those weren't allotted to you, Israel, so you stay away from them. Back again, remember this? So we're going to sum it up again by going back to the original Song of Moses. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage or inheritance. Does it make sense now? How they looked at this? So what were the initial differences between Israel and the other nations following this dispersion of peoples across the earth? When God threw everybody across the earth and he called and he had just Abraham, what was the difference between Abraham, that nation, than all the others? It's kind of an obvious question. Who their God was, right? Who their deity is. There's obviously the physical land differences. I mean, Abram didn't even have land. We had to get him to the land that would eventually be his. Abram was a nomad. It was his children who reached the promised land, that inherited it. The culture was different. Would you agree? Israelite culture, Hebrew culture was different than the other cultures around them. It's no different today. Cultures are different, aren't they? Was his culture and customs different from the rest of the peoples of the earth at the time of his calling? At the time of his calling, they were all from Noah. Everybody was pretty much the same. But then as people were dispersed and they went in different places, they developed new customs. They had apparently started to worship other deities, and things began to change across the face of the earth, didn't it? And they obviously had a different deity. That's the key. That's probably the most important one, right? Was Abram's deity different at the time of his calling than all the others? And if there's no dispersion yet, I mean, if the dispersion has just started, maybe there was. But at one point, it was just everybody was supposed to worship God, right? Remember? I mean, Garden, Noah, his kids, even Babel. We're going to make God come to us. Would it be important to keep Israel distinct from the other nations? In this case, in the Old Testament case, oh yeah, because there was purpose. They were going to be the kingdom of priests. Here it is. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. Notice God says that. All the nations are really mine. But you're going to be unique. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests. Priests to who? The other nations. That was how it was going to work. Why did Jesus come out of Israel and not somewhere else? That was the promise. The kingdom of priests. I'm going to bring the Messiah, the one who brings salvation to all, the high priest, from that nation. And he did it. God hasn't deviated from the plan. So what was the purpose of the group of Israel? Set the standard. Bear the mark of Yahweh. Don't take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. That doesn't mean cursing. What does that mean? Your identification with Yahweh. You don't take his name upon you as your identification in vain because you represent him. Now, I think that involves language too, but that's what it means. What would happen to ancient Israel if they had embraced and endorsed all of the surrounding nations' culture and beliefs? They kind of did some of that, didn't they? What would happen? They wouldn't be distinct anymore, would they? They become worthless to some degree. God actually calls them that. You've become worthless because you no longer are the kingdom of priests. You've just turned into a hodgepodge of every other nation. In fact, you're even worse than the other ones, he even says. What is the result of some of those beliefs and cultures were contrary to the character, instruction, and plans of their God, Yahweh? They bring in other culture, and it's against God's culture. It's contradictory to it. What happens when that takes place? Punishment. God's going to punish. In a practical sense, what happens to the people's interactions? How do you run a country when these... Yeah, there's no distinction anymore. It just becomes a hodgepodge, which is what happened to Israel, wasn't it? Look at this, Deuteronomy 31. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers. Well, who's he talking to? Moses. You're about to die, and you're going to hand it off. And I just want to give you a quick little, hey, here's what's going to happen. Then this people will rise and whore after the foreign gods among them in the land that they are entering, and they will forsake me and break my covenant that I have made with them. Then my anger will be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them and hide my face from them, and they will be devoured. And many evils and troubles will come upon them, so that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? And I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil that they have done, because they have turned to other gods. Yikes. They were supposed to serve Yahweh. If you keep my covenant. Remember the big if I bolded and underlined and italicized? At the core of Hebrew society and identity was Yahweh, right? He was it, right at the center. His laws, his worship, his character, fill in the blank. When they allowed in other cultures without restraint, conditions, and without protecting their own, I should say national identity there, what happened? What happened to them? Because what did God want them to do? What did he want them to preserve? Him, the identity of their nation. What it was founded on, established for, its purpose. If you lose that, there's no use of you. You've become worthless. 1 Kings 16, look at this one. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ithbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Not a great king. What's he doing, essentially, to provoke God? He's bringing their stuff into this sacred land. He's not protecting the identity of Israel as founded upon God, is he? And if you don't do that, what's going to happen? It's not only going to be judgment, but what are you going to do to the people? What happens to Israel when they start to think that there's government-promoted worship of other deities? Some people will follow and say, well, and they turn from God. So not only does he turn the nation, he turns the people, which is the nation, and start to have all kinds of problems. Why was this marriage a bad thing for Israel? He married Jezebel. And what's Jezebel's background? What's her history? Who's her dad? He's a king of the Sidonians. You know he was a priest of Baal? And so she brings her religion in, and what does he do? In order to make his wife feel comfortable in the new place that she's living, what does he do? You can worship your God right here. And that's where it began, you know. You ever seen this? Drives me nuts. You notice you have things in here that cannot coexist. Why? They are contradictory truth claims. If I say Jesus is Lord, like the cross on the end, and yet you have the symbol of Islam that says Jesus is not Lord, how can they ever coexist? One of them has to take priority.
According to Jesus, they can't.
They cannot. So when I see this driving around, it's like, oh boy. This bumper sticker drives me crazy. It's just, the idea here is everybody just in the nations all get along. The reality is we have different truth claims. We have different deities. We have different facts that we attest to as being the truth. And when they're contradictory, they cannot coexist. It can't happen. Because something has to take precedence, which means someone has to give, and someone has to say, I'm taking. And none of these groups want to do that, do they? A national culture rooted and established on the God of the Bible is not compatible with a culture that is not. True? Therefore, the nation founded on God must continually work to protect that culture and identity, or it will have no identity at all. Agreed? That is what Israel failed to do by going out and saying, well, let's make these alliances, let's compromise our identity for whatever reasons. This does not mean that other peoples cannot be welcomed, valued, provided benefits to a new nation, right? That's not the same as you get to take and bring your identity and take it over. However, they must prioritize the beliefs, values, and culture of the new nation. We'd call that assimilation, right? You come in, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. That's kind of the old adage. When you come in, you don't say, I'm going to take my culture, my beliefs, my deity, and make it the God of this country. You have to have some ultimate submission to say that's this nation's God. Now, what's the beauty of America? We say you can come in with your God, and we're not going to shut you down, but you're not going to establish your God as the God of this nation. We'll give you the freedom to worship here. But this nation's founded on Yahweh. That's started to change, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
See what happens? Now look where we are. So there's been these battles over culture and over beliefs for a long time. They're still battling. Think about Israel. They're in a battle right now with the Iranians. Why does Iran want them dead? Why do they want them gone? I mean, ultimately it's spiritual. Ultimately.
Yes.
Conflict always proceeds from two groups with contradictory beliefs asserting themselves as the priority worldview. Would you agree? Someone's got to be the top. You go to this country, who's in charge? Or you just have to say, no one is, and we embrace everything. Welcome to America 2024. It's called relativism.
Oh, yeah.
And in relativism, there is no truth, which in itself is an absolute truth statement. So it doesn't work. It just doesn't work logically. The principles of logic are gone out the door, which is not surprising right now.
And they celebrate everything.
Everything gets celebrated. Everything. Look at this, 2 Corinthians. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Why do you think God says that? Because he hates unbelievers? No, he loves them. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? They don't believe the same thing you do. Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? Do you see God's perspective on keeping things separate that need to be because of the danger of mixing beliefs and confusion that can come with that? Deuteronomy 7, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgasites, goes through all these groups. 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons. Hey, Ahab, write this one down, underline it. Or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. You see what God's perspective is? Preserve his worship, his people for himself. So does all this mean that God is against any different people groups intermingling in a nation? No. Some people will say that. That's not true, but they'll say, see, this is where God's anti. He wants segregation and all these things. Is God against all immigration? No, he's not. Look at this, Exodus 22:21. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. That's an interesting statement. I want to show you something on this particular verse. We're going to look at it in Hebrew for a second. Here it is in Hebrew.
Okay.
Okay, you can see the blue word. That's the word sojourners. It's ger or gerim, okay, in Hebrew. G-E-R. Okay, that's it. Sojourners, ger, if I take ger and I expand it, you see over on the right there, it's kind of highlighted. What does ger in Hebrew mean? Protected citizen or stranger. It can be used to distinguish people groups. So when we hear this, we just think, oh, sojourner is just a foreigner, like an illegal alien or a legal alien. But it's a specific term in Hebrew that means a person who's not of Israelite descent that is a legal citizen. They have a protected status. Now, how do we know this? Let me show you this verse. You shall not eat any carcass. You may give it to the alien who is in your towns, and he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people for Yahweh your God. You may not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, so it's like these weird rules that God had. If I blow this one up, look at, there's the term alien. Look what it says. Ger. Okay. But look at the term foreigner. It's a different word. Different Hebrew word. There's two different words in Hebrew to distinguish two different groups. So if you have people living among you, some are identified as ger. In this case, it's written in English as alien. And he says, who are in your towns. These are protected people in your towns who are not from Israel. And you can give this stuff to them because their culture is going to be different. But there's also people called, he says foreigner, but that's a different word. These are non-protected people from outside of Israel. And he says, you can go sell it to them if you want. Remember, they're not inside. You have to go sell stuff to them. They're not protected citizens. Two different groups exist when you talk about foreigners in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. The protected ones and those who are not. Those who are part of Israel and viewed that way, and those who are not, even though they're not from Israel specifically. Two different words. So there's that word. Here's Leviticus. And when an alien dwells with you, there's a ger. This is the protected citizen. Remember, they've come in, they've assimilated to Israelite culture, and then God says, here's how you interact with them. When an alien dwells with you in your land, you shall not oppress him. The alien who is dwelling with you shall be like a native among you, and you shall love him like yourself, because you were ger. You were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. What's the difference between the alien and foreigner in these terms? It's kind of interesting, huh, when you really break it down? So what's the biblical difference between these two terms? And what does it mean to be a, quote, Israelite when you have these things pop up? So you have people from outside nations who say, I want to join Israel. And God says, okay, we have a process. You come in, we'll make you a protected citizen, we'll give you the benefits, but we recognize that you are a different culture. You're not taking that and running over the Israelite culture, though. You will become part of us. We will not become part of you. The foreigner is the person who is interacting with Israel, but they are not under protected status. They are not receiving the benefits of the nation. In fact, here I'll do a little breakdown. So here's the alien, ger, an individual who had become part of national Israel and was given the nation's benefits. God gave clear instructions to not look down on these people who joined the nation because they weren't Jewish. You see how God's perspective is? Treat these people who have joined you and who are trying to be part of your country like citizens of your country. Don't be a racist. It's kind of the best way to put it, isn't it? God reminds them of their time in Egypt. Well, that's kind of important. The Hebrews grew in number after Joseph. Remember, he becomes the second highest in Egypt, and he brings his family, and they get Goshen, and they start to multiply. Are they there legally or illegally? They're there legally because the second in command had the okay from Pharaoh, and from the governmental standpoint, they said, come on in, we'll give you this land. They were not breaking into the country. Do you realize that? Everybody was okay with them being there. There was no laws being violated. They were welcomed. And they grew, and then all of a sudden what happens? They start to grow, they get too numerous, and Pharaoh sees it a problem. He says, we got to get rid of the Hebrews. And God says, I want you to remember what it was like to be a Hebrew in a different culture. How did you like the treatment they gave you as Egyptians? When you were there doing the right things, you were there by the right reasons, and they treated you so poorly. Remember that when you have people here who have joined Israel and are not from Israel. Makes sense? The Hebrews did not illegally enter the country, but lived within Egypt, and all agreed. The Hebrews did not demand the Egyptians prioritize their beliefs, despite being very different than the Egyptian culture. They didn't come in and say, today we overthrow Ra and we put Yahweh in charge of Pharaoh. Didn't happen, 400 years. They wanted to worship on their own and do their thing and be left alone to do it in peace. And Pharaoh is the one that had a problem with them because they were getting to be too many, and he was afraid what would happen, that someday they might overthrow him and get rid of Ra and all of his other deities. God punished and rebuked the Egyptians for their poor treatment of the Hebrews living lawfully in Egypt. Ultimately, I'm taking you out of here. But they had to pay quite a price before they would let them go. Foreigner, this is the different word. This is the other term in Hebrew. An individual who had not assimilated and joined Israel legally. You can go sell them stuff because their culture will allow you to eat that. Go sell it to them. This is not the people who are in your towns who are legally residing there. Different group. These individuals were not offered the benefits of the citizens. That's the key. So here's some takeaways. The Bible does not support the idea of breaking a nation's law in order to enter it. Never does. Even in the case of Egypt and the Israelites being there, it was not against Egyptian law. Government obligation would be to punish those individuals. Remember Romans 13? What's the role of the government? Why are we supposed to submit to the authorities? They're there for your good and to punish wrong. Well, how do you know what's good and right? Or how do you know what's good and bad in a nation? You have laws. Some are probably not great laws. But overall, there has to be some guidance, right? The Bible does not say a nation must embrace immigration. Did you know that? It never says you have to allow it. It's really kind of left open to the nation. Romans 13:4. For he, it's talking about the government or the leader, the authority, is God's servant for who? So if it's not good to have immigration, what under this is the responsibility of the government? Don't do it. Or if you need to do it in a certain way because it's for the good of the people there, then what? Do it that way. That's the key. Your good. They're there for your good, to make sure that you prosper, not them. If immigration, legal or illegal, at any point causes harm to those within the country who are already under the care of the government, can it rightfully be called good? I would say no. It's harming the people of the nation who are under your care. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So here's a few more questions. I know I told you I had a lot of them today. If a nation passes law that says no immigration, okay, I'm going extreme. There's a law in the books we're going to pretend is passed by a nation that says there's no immigration. Can one biblically justify breaking the nation's law in order to get into the country? Based on Romans 13. What if they've made that rule? Now, what if there's a rule that says, yeah, we'll have some, but here's how you're going to do it? It would be even harder to justify it. Well, it might be a little bit, easier to get in because you have a method now of doing it. It'd be harder to justify it because now you have to say, well, I have to forego the things that have been put in place to let me do this in the right way and do it the wrong way. You still can't even do it with this one. It's the rule. Be prepared if you cross the border, what's going to happen? They may just take you right out. They arrest you. What if my reasons are of pure intention? I just want to make a better life for me and my family. I'm just looking for work. See, this is where law doesn't care about your feelings. Law is about the rule of law. Thou shalt not fill in the blank. steal, murder. And when you do those things, what are you potentially subjecting yourself to? The punishment of doing it. You can have the best intention in the world. The law doesn't care how you feel. Because if it did, we'd be changing it all the time. And we do that now all the time, it seems like, right? But in the purest form, it shouldn't matter. If you violate this rule, there's going to be punishment for it. What is the role of a nation's government at the fundamental level? Promote good, punish evil by enforcing the laws. So if you don't enforce the laws, what's the point of having them, right? Which is kind of the debate that goes on with immigration a lot of times. If we have these laws that say this, why don't we just follow the laws? Do we need reform if we already have laws that say you can do this or that? No, we just need to do what's already there, right? So what happens to a country that doesn't enforce their immigration laws or any laws? What happens? Chaos. They're no longer a country. Because if you don't have a country guided by principles and rules, anything goes. Anybody comes in, anybody goes out, anybody can bring any culture or any deity or anything and they can promote it to the highest levels and it just becomes a hodgepodge. There is no identity anymore. American identity and American culture just has been diluted or just started to disappear, hasn't it? I mean, I spent, a couple days on vacation. We were at Mount Rushmore. You want to go up there and you just feel like this. It's amazing to see these guys and then listen to the video of what these guys went through in establishing the country and the things that they did, and they put them on the rock and you're like, oh my goodness, like it's a surreal experience being there. And all I saw was patriotic people. Melissa and I were like, wow, this is our kind of crowd. They were all older. There was no one with little kids. And we were like the youngest ones there. And they all had their America hats on and their flags. And it was like people who actually valued American culture because of its founding. And it was refreshing. It was nice. Because it's not a bad thing, despite what we're told in the media. And it is a beautiful thing that you can have a country where everyone can come and be free. But the founders didn't mean we're going to lose American identity in that venture. And we have somewhere along the lines lost that. Because Israel did the same thing. When they started to invite and promote all these other things, what happened to their country? And what are we doing?
Well, how much?
In an attempt to cater, what do? We just elevate. And there was a time when if you were escaping Stalinist Russia, you came to America, you didn't expect cater, you just wanted to become here so you could thrive. It's different now. It's different. So this question popped in my head this week. What does it mean to be an American? Does it have any meaning anymore?
No.
It kind of was like, what do you mean? I went to Mount Rushmore and I kind of feel like I stepped back into a time when I actually know what it means. Like I saw it again for a couple days. And I can envision, in fact, when I was gone over the last couple weeks, Pastor Ray came in Thursday and he was talking to me. He's like, hey, congratulations. You got your first hate comments on YouTube for your abortion videos. And I said, well, then we're doing a good job. You're doing the right thing. I can't imagine what I'll probably get on this one. But, because what's going to happen is anybody watches this, they're going to say, whoa, wait a second. You guys are a bunch of racist, backwoods people who just think that it's all about America. No, we're all about freedom, but preserving that culture that's based on God and a biblical foundation. And I'm not willing to compromise that. And yet you get called what? Anti-whatever race, anti-whatever. But that's how the world does this because we're trying to preserve something. When you think about the founding, what was it founded for? On God. All men created equal by God. There was God underlied everything. And that's being slowly ripped out. Maybe not even slowly anymore. I just want to show you this before we go. Paul says this in Galatians. He says, know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Now, why did I throw this one in there? It kind of ties into the last question. What does it mean to be an American? Can you be a German Russian and come here and become an American?
Yes.
because you embrace the faith and beliefs of the country. And now what? We would say they're more American than there's people out there today who were born here, born Americans, and they have rejected the beliefs and the founding of America, haven't they? Who's American in that example? That's my question. One is by birth, the other is by belief. How does God look at that when it comes to his nation, Israel? There are national Israelites, but when they say, hey, our father's Abraham, you can't tell us who we are. What does he says? No, your father is the devil, because you have rejected God and by faith. It doesn't matter what you're born as. See the spiritual piece, the cosmic geography, and the also national geography? And my question is, I want Americans, I don't care where they came from. I don't care what they are. What should they embrace? What we were founded on and our beliefs in this country. And so as we get ready to vote here, and we're like 30 days away, you have to decide which candidate is going to embrace that, protect that, and which one's not. Or maybe they both aren't. I don't know. You have to make that call. Which one thinks American culture is worth protecting?